Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life. Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for feelings you may experience while listening to this new company update, so please hold any comments and concerns until the end of the mandatory company-wide notice. And as always, remember to smile. Smile. You are the face of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.
Hey everyone, this video is going to be a little bit different because it's kind of a theory video, but not really in the traditional sense. I like to try and uphold opposing viewpoints and give my thoughts on them with regular theories. However, since this video is more of a prediction video with my reasoning as to why I think it's going to be that way, I won't really be delving into any opposing theories. I want to try and get out my glitch trap video soon, however, and with so much FNAF content releasing very soon, I figured it might be best to wait anyways. If you want some teasers for my thoughts on glitch trap, however, go check out Draz's video on his channel. Fazbear Entertainment makes an appearance in its own sponsored segment, so go check it out and give some support while you're there. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into my predictions for Secret of the Mimic. Starting out, I want to be forthfront and say that I believe that this game will not be within the continuity of the books. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think the books won't line up. I believe that this game will follow the story of the Mimic and its general plot points. However, it will play out slightly differently from what we know in the books. I believe in a theory called Tales adaptation at the moment, which essentially means that the general story points laid out in the books will be followed, however, the details surrounding those plot points will be altered in the game's timeline to allow for more interesting gameplay, and also to keep fans of the books on their toes just as much as fans of the games. I don't think it would be very interesting if the events of the books played out exactly one-to-one in the games, because that means that there's not a whole lot of room for theorizing left. The community theorizing is what keeps the FNAF franchise alive, and so removing the possibilities for theories generally is a poor business practice, which means that they likely want to keep things as open-ended as possible, which is exactly what we're seeing in the game so far. I want to point out, however, that no matter what happens in the game, the books 100% cannot be within the full continuity of the games because of the Storyteller. I imagine most people watching this video know at least the general details of the events in the books, but in case you haven't familiarized yourself with them yet, or simply would enjoy a refresher, there are three main stories and tales from the Pizzaplex that mostly involve the Mimic. Really, there are two, that being the story The Mimic and the Storyteller, with the third one being Tiger Rock. However, for the sake of theorizing about a timeline, its only relevancy is that the animatronic Tiger Rock takes the form of a white tiger with heterochromia, which is a direct callback to the Mimic. So for now, I'll just recap the important two. In the story The Mimic, Edwin Murray is an inventor with his wife Fiona Murray, and together they were running a business out of a rundown lace factory and lived in a small Queen Anne style house. Fiona gets pregnant but then tragically dies during childbirth, leaving Edwin as a single father. Without the help of Fiona, he is unable to continue with his business and is forced to sell his company and house to Fazbear Entertainment, where they have him build animatronic endoskeletons to retrofit inside mascot costumes. Edwin struggles to meet the deadlines Fazbear puts on him while maintaining the struggles of parenthood as a single father, so he builds a robot for his son David that is meant to copy his actions so that it can play with him, which he names Mimic. Also, Edwin and David have been living inside the rundown factory the entire time. One day while playing, David's ball he was tossing around with the Mimic somehow ends up outside, as Edwin forgot to lock the door to the factory, and David is tragically hit by a white van and dies while chasing the ball. Edwin disassociates for 2 weeks and then realizes that he had been making upgrades to the Mimic in his mindlessness and grief. But upon coming back to reality and seeing the Mimic still copying his son David, Edwin ruthlessly beats the Mimic and abandons the factory, leaving the Mimic behind. Fazbear then sends in a team to repair and retrieve tech that Edwin was meant to finish for them, and the team finds the Mimic and repairs it, but is then brutally killed by it. Fazbear hears nothing from this team, so they send in another one, and this team meets the same fate. There is then a time skip of 36 years where Edwin is working for Fazbear at the Pizzaplex with a position that provides immunity from being fired due to the nature of his buyout contract for his company 3.5 decades prior. The CEO of Fazbear decides to fire the creative team in favor of AI that can create stories and calls it the Storyteller. Edwin is furious but has no power to stop it, and is placed as the sole member on the creative team to quote-unquote guide the Storyteller's narratives it creates. Edwin demands to know what program the Storyteller is running on, but Mr. Burroughs refuses to tell him, and so Edwin sneaks into the tree housing the computer running the program and is given a PTSD flashback because the computer is modeled after a specific white tiger. He then learns the program being run is called Mimic 1, which is the same program Edwin developed for the Mimic animatronic. Mr. Burroughs eventually locks Edwin in the tree one night as Edwin had been attempting to do something to the program to fix the issues arising in the Pizzaplex ever since the Mimic 1 program took over, and Edwin dies from suffocation. Now, with the recap out of the way, while I claim that the events listed can't be within continuity, that doesn't mean that the books can't still happen in the games. It just means that the details have to be incorrect. What I'm referring to is the timeline that the Storyteller has to take place in based on the teasers we've received for Secret of the Mimic so far. The teasers have twice now laid out the date 1979, one in the first trailer and the other in Help 1 and 2 update to receive the Tiger Plush. We also know that the game is confirmed to take place in the 70s thanks to Steelwool's creative director Edwin in his interview with Dawko. These two details likely mean that the game takes place in 1979, as suggested. We know from both the Mimic and the Storyteller that Edwin was 28 during the events of the Mimic, and he and Fiona had David 4 years prior, where Fiona tragically died during childbirth. We are then also told several times that Edwin is 64 during the events of the Storyteller, and that he spent the latter half of 3 decades running away from his past before finally giving in and returning to Fazbear after he ran out of money. I want to be clear, this is very likely not a writing error, and instead is most likely the actual information the writers were given to work with by Scott, due to how many times the information is repeated, and also due to the fact that these stories were in development after Security Breach released, which means it was when Scott took a more active role in what was being output in an attempt to course correct from the story Security Breach ended up being. Here's all the instances of Edwin explicitly stated to be 64, and that he spent several decades away from Fazbear. These meetings were generally a waste of time, but given that Edwin had been placed onto the board via Fazbear Entertainment's buyout of his engineering company decades before, he was expected to be here. Edwin at 64 years old was the oldest person in the room. Edwin Murray was at an age where he knew who he was and he knew who he wasn't. Never, not even when he was as young as Mr. Burroughs, a good-looking fellow. Edwin had accepted that his imagination was his greatest strength. When he'd been young, his round nose, slightly slanted big blue eyes, and 2 large ears had given Edwin a gnomish appearance. As he'd aged, he decided to get playful with that fact. Edwin's chest constricted. His doctor had told him he shouldn't let himself get riled up. It was bad for his heart. Edwin had his issues, he knew. He'd been haunted for years by things he should have done differently. Edwin, his heart still galloping in his chest, spent the next couple minutes concentrating on his respiration. His cardiologist had taught him a breathing exercise to slow his heart rate and lower his blood pressure. In all honesty, Fazbear posters reminded Edwin of a past he'd rather have forgotten. Maybe keeping the images of Freddy Fazbear close was Edwin's way of keeping himself on the hook for all the mistakes he'd made. Mistakes that had snowballed into a disaster the day he'd agreed to sell his company to the behemoth that was Fazbear Entertainment. The truth was that even though Edwin tried to make himself useful at the company and tried to live a semi-normal life, he was rarely actually in the present moment. He lived primarily in the past, back in the days before he'd made a hash of everything. Edwin's cardiologist had recommended that Edwin see a therapist, and the therapist had told Edwin that he had to learn to be mindful. You must stop reliving what's no longer real, the therapist had said. Practice mindfulness. Concentrate on the details of reality around you. Be present. That was easier said than done, so he didn't even bother to try. Yes, he moved through the real world, but he didn't see much of it. What was in front of him was usually obscured by visions of his old life, replaying his worst mistakes, images of what he'd once had and lost. As he climbed, Edwin kept his gaze forward. In spite of his ticker's problems, he was reasonably fit for his age. Edwin's whole body, for that matter, wasn't happy with him. Although Edwin hadn't had a good night's sleep in decades, he at least usually managed 4 or 5 sporadic hours. Edwin had spent the better part of 3 decades trying to forget. If anyone had told Edwin 40 years before that this is where he'd end up, he'd have laughed himself silly. This hadn't just been Edwin's 24-year-old ego talking. Your company is going to change the world, Fiona had told him every morning when he got up and went to the old warehouse where he tinkered with his inventions and built his machines. So, with all of that said, it's very clear in my opinion that they were paying very close attention to his age and how old he was. Practically every time Edwin himself was mentioned in this story, they mention either his age and how it was affecting him, or his past and how he keeps reliving it. I understand that there are known author errors within the books. However, Edwin's age is actually completely consistent within the books. The issue with Edwin's age is that the timeline provided for Secret of the Mimic makes that detail impossible. Let's do some quick math. I'm going to start out with the assumption that the books are within continuity and that 1979 is the absolute latest possible year that David could have died, as we know from John FNAF's interview with Steelwool that Secret of the Mimic takes place in the 70s, and since the Mimic is there, it's around the time of David's death. Edwin would be 28 at this time, as stated in both the Mimic and the Storyteller, and since he's 64 in the Storyteller, that makes it take place 36 years after the absolute latest possible date for Secret of the Mimic, 1979. This places the events of the Storyteller in 2015. Given that one of the earliest dates for FNAF 3 is 2015, this should be impossible, as the Pizzaplex is built on top of the wreckage of the FNAF 6 fire, which is after FNAF 3. Even if we start getting crazy and say that the MCI happened in 83 and FNAF 3 is 2013, 30 years after that, or that 30 years is more an approximation and it's more like 27 to 28 years after, this would still be impossible because of Mr. Burroughs. Mr. Burroughs is 35 and is stated to have started going to college at the age of 13. If we give him, say, 10 years to have completed college, which is a very generous estimation given how young he started and the implication that he's very intelligent because of this fact. That means that he would have graduated at 23. Why does this matter, you may ask? Well, because Mr. Burroughs states that he has started working for Fazbear immediately out of college because of how immensely successful they already were, and he knew that it would be a good opportunity to make money fast. The implication in the text is that he started working for the Pizzaplex at this time, because of how massively successful Fazbear was. This would mean that the Pizzaplex would have been built and already massively successful in 2003, which doesn't fit with any stretching of any timeline. The only ways it would be possible is if he only worked for Fazbear when it was still just a pizza chain. However, it's extremely unlikely the intention would be that Mr. Burroughs was working for Fazbear in the early 2000s. Now, I want to make it clear, the issue here is that the information given in the games, which we know is a fact as canon, causes issues with the information in the books. Now, yes, this could just be an oversight, but placing the building of the Mega Pizzaplex in around 2003 at the latest would be the most egregious oversight I've ever seen. So, what happened? Well, if the two mediums aren't in continuity with each other, suddenly things work a lot better. Let's say that in the books, David dies in, 1993. This would make the Storyteller take place in 2029, which lines up with one of the possible years for the calendar and security breach, and in general is a lot closer to when people assume these events in the books take place. There's nothing in the books stating what Fazbear as a company looked like at this time. All we know is that they're an enterprise by the time of the buyout. Nothing in this hypothetical set of events contradicts anything else within the continuity of the books. Same applies for the games. Nothing within the games contradicts any other information within the games. Issues only arise when we try to combine the two. Now, does this mean that the events of the books can't or don't take place within the games? No. It just means that what we're told in the books is not 100% accurate to the games. The stories can be the same, but the details can't. So why does any of this matter? Well, as we just went over, the details in the books cannot be accurate to the games. And since this is true, that means that what we're told for the events in the books have the possibility to be different as well. Remember, nothing in the books contradicts itself for the stories and plots told. However, this is also true for the games, which means that the two aren't reliant on each other. The books can tell their own story, and the games can tell theirs, and the plot lines can line up, but just because we see similar things in both continuities doesn't mean that it's the same continuity. In fact, we've already seen this exact same dynamic before. The very first book trilogy Scott released for Five Nights at Freddy's was the Silver Rise trilogy, and it contained many of the same events and characters we would see within the games, and in general helped clear up a lot of the questions. But there were also things within the series that could not be within the same continuity of the events in the games. So, to reiterate, the novel trilogy gave us the same characters and general overall events as the games, and yet contained details that absolutely could not fit within the game's continuity. Sound familiar? We have characters from Tales that are the same, Edwin, David, and Fiona and the Mimic, and the general same events, and yet there are details within that can't be within continuity. And as such, I believe we might very well see events in the games play out relatively similar, but different nonetheless. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the details we've seen in the games so far and take them at face value, and see how that might differ from the books. We see that Edwin Murray was a contractor, an immediate contradiction, that he made the Mimic endoskeleton for Fazbear, another contradiction. This next bit contains very mild spoilers about which voice actors voice which characters, so proceed at your own risk, but we have confirmation that Jim Meskimen is voicing Edwin Murray, and since his wife Tamara Meskimen and his daughter Taylor Meskimen are also voicing characters, it can be fairly safe to assume that they'll be voicing Fiona and David respectively. This bit is off script, but just recently it was confirmed by Jim Meskimen that his wife Tamara Meskimen and his daughter Taylor Meskimen are indeed voicing Fiona and David in the games. If you're confused about David being voiced by a woman, it's common in voice acting to have young characters regardless of their gender be voiced by women voice actors, since they can often hit higher vocal ranges than men can. Gregory is also voiced by a woman, so it's not a case of David being gender swapped. Anyways, since we know that the whole Meskimen family is voicing the Murray family, we can also assume that the family in the MCM archive advertisements are also the Murrays, as Jim also voices the man in these commercials. Now, this may be looking at the meta too much, but since David has a voice in these commercials, as seen in the Mycelium Men advertisement, and Fiona is also voiced, as seen in the Stay Up Latte commercial, I believe it's safe to assume that since the Fiona character is alive and voicing a character in the same commercials that David is alive, this would seem to imply that Fiona was alive for these parts of David's life, which is again another contradiction, and a big one at that. This information would also be supported by the fact that these commercials seem to mirror Edwin's life, starting out with him and Fiona as co-workers, and then later showing them living together with a son, and then the next two commercials show that son growing older between them, with Edwin and Fiona still happily married. The advertisements also depict the Mimic program being implemented into Edwin's household appliances, which had already gone under by the time of the Mimic. We also see that the warehouse in Secret of the Mimic and the MCM company are in very productive state, set up for a multitude of workers with an entire tool dedicated to tell you where a worker is to be positioned due to the massive size of the company. We also see from packages Steelwool has been sending to select YouTubers that the MCM company has been around for years, and that Edwin himself had been working there. This bit is also not in the script as I'm recording this the same day that this information came out, but in the latest teaser for Steelwool, the teasers that are a countdown of how many days until Secret of the Mimic, today was a teaser for 3 days until the game releases, and in this teaser, if we brighten the image, we can see that the mannequins in the image have the MCM logo and also 1972 written on them, which seems to indicate that at the very least the MCM company was open in 1972, which lines up with the packages Steelwool had been sending saying that the people being fired had been working there for years. Alright, back to the script. I know that saying the books likely aren't in continuity is not a very popular opinion, but at the moment that's where I stand. Since we know that the details aren't possible to be within continuity of the games, it's very possible that the events aren't in exact continuity either. That leads me to believe that the contradictions we've seen so far are to be taken at face value, and as a separate set of events from one another. The way I see it, the books are 100% reliant on the games to tell the story they want to tell, however, the games are not reliant on the books. If the books didn't exist, it would still be possible to create the story we have created for the games because they exist within and are reliant only on their own continuity of events. It might have taken us longer, sure, but we'd get there eventually. So with that in mind, I wanted to take a look at what the story surrounding the Mimic might be based on what we've seen from the game's events only, while using the books to fill in minor gaps that the games might struggle to tell within their own medium. To start out, I believe that what we're told in the Secret of the Mimic teaser is 100% factual and accurate. I believe that we are a worker of Fazbear being sent to retrieve the Mimic after Edwin's disappearance. Since we see bodies in the trailer for Secret of the Mimic, I believe it's safe to assume that we're then Team B from the story the Mimic entails. This would then make Secret of the Mimic an adaptation of the story the Mimic, and since the factory Edwin is working out of clearly appears different in the games, I believe it's safe to assume that the origin story of the Mimic is mildly different as well. With this in mind, since we see the Mimic technology in the advertisements that contain the Murray family, including Fiona, and given that the worker briefing us in the beginning states that Edwin was a contractor, I believe it's very likely that in this adaptation, Fiona lives through childbirth, and Edwin develops the technology of the Mimic specifically for the purpose of assisting in everyday chores, which is something he says he would have liked to do in the books. This would likely have saved his failing appliance business, meaning that he was never forced to sell to Fazbear. This places the creation of mimicking technology before David's birth, and for the purpose of assistance with everyday tasks. There are then 2 ways I can foresee the story progressing from this point. Since we know that Fazbear claims they contracted the Mimic to be made, it's possible this is the origin. William might have come up with the design in his mind to be contracted and then likely added to the Fun Times, since the Fun Times and the Mimic share so many similar properties and abilities. I believe if this is the case, Edwin might have realized how useful it would be in assisting with raising David, and so he made one as a prototype for his son before making one for Fazbear, and after his death, Fazbear decides to claim the prototype he made. The other way I can see the story progressing is that Edwin made the Mimic for his son only, and upon seeing it, Fazbear requested one for themselves, but David died before Edwin was able to produce one, and so again they decide to steal the one made for David instead. Before Fazbear decides to claim the endo made for David, however, Edwin in a fit of grief beats the Mimic, same as in the books. This would then teach the Mimic violence, and as we see in the Storyteller, there was some event in the past that gave Edwin PTSD that he felt guilt over. I believe that it's very likely the Mimic was repaired while the factory was still running, and Edwin was still around. And then the Mimic does what it was designed to do, and goes on a rampage since Edwin had now taught it violence. This would mean that everyone in the warehouse was either killed or fled from the Mimic, which lines up with the Fazbear worker briefing us hesitantly, saying it may be malfunctioning and warning us that responsibility for our death or injury falls on ourselves, as Fazbear would know what it was capable of if it had already gone on a killing spree. This would then be Edwin's reason for running away, and also provide an explanation for the mysterious event in the Storyteller that traumatized him. This series of events, I feel personally, is a solid explanation for the differences we see in the games and books, and still provides answers for what happened in the books regarding Edwin's trauma. Even with this set of events, however, I feel that there's still more opportunity to theorize. The next thing I want to delve into is Afton's involvement with MCM, and why they started contracting to Edwin, and it all leads back to Glitchtrap. We know that Glitchtrap is the felt suit of the Spring Bonnie mascot, and this appearance of Spring Bonnie very closely matches the mascot we see in the advertisements for Fredbear's Family Diner. So what does this mean? Well, I believe it's very possible that Fredbear started out using suits like this instead of Springlock suits when it first started, and since we know that Fazbear assigned Edwin with making endoskeletons to put inside mascot costumes, I believe it's very possible that the Glitchtrap felt suit was sent to Edwin by Afton to be turned into an animatronic. But here's where it starts to get crazy. I think Edwin may have been the creator of the Springlock suits. Now, I know this completely goes against the novel trilogy and most people's timelines, minds, including my own. But let's take a look at what a Springlock costume actually is. We see in FNAF 4 that the endoskeletons are separate from the suit itself, and yet must be interconnected within the suits, as that's the entire function of it. Well, if the suits are fixated within crossbeams and braces for the endoskeletons to attach to, this could explain it. In fact, this is exactly what we hear Phone Guy describe the shellings as. So if this is the case, since we know that the endoskeletons of the Springlocks are something that can be inserted into and combined within a suit, that means that it's then very possible that this was the purpose Fazbear had for contracting Edwin to begin with, since his whole job in the books was creating endoskeletons to be inserted into suits. Now, this is still a stretch, I know, so what else is there to support this? Well, Steelwool sent John FNAF and Fusion Z boxes for marketing that included a Spring Bonnie bobblehead, indicating the Spring Bonnie mascot is going to be important to the story in some way. Okay, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the Springlock suit itself will be important, it could just be the felt costume, so what else can we look at? Well, how about the fact that we see Edwin designing costumes with animatronic parts inside them, and since the costumes are felt and stitched together like the glitch trap suit, this could then indicate that these mascot costumes are ones that were meant to be worn by people, and yet still contain the animatronic parts within them. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that the costume was a Springlock or was intended to be worn by people. It could just be a design choice. You got me there. But I've still got an ace up my sleeve. We know for a fact that the warehouse is not owned by Fazbear, as stated in Daco's interview with Steelwool, which would indicate that the things inside aren't all owned by Fazbear. Other companies are hiring Edwin too, such as Swing Bee Honey. Okay, so what does this have to do with Springlocks? Well, if Fazbear doesn't own everything inside the warehouse, that implies that everything within is something made in the factory and then would have been shipped out to different companies contracting him, correct? This means that Edwin undeniably made at least one Springlock suit. How does that correlate, you may ask? The Springlock Jester costume from the books. It originated from Edwin's factory, meaning he produced it. And since the game takes place before Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opened, it's likely these are the animatronics Fazbear was contracting him to make. I know that's a big thing to claim, however, I truly feel it's incredibly likely. I'm not entirely sure what the timeline of events would look like if this were true, so I'll leave the rest of this open and hope that we'll receive the answers when the game releases, tomorrow as the time of this video. Now, there's one more thing I want to theorize about, but from what I've seen, it's not something a lot of people will be pleased with, and it involves the Mimic. I believe that this game will show us the Mimic becoming possessed by David after his death. I know many of us feel that this would ruin the character and themes of the Mimic, but I'd love if you heard me out on this. Mamakato is the first person I've seen to suggest this idea, and her video on it is really good, so I recommend you check it out. Now, while I agree with her that the Mimic is possessed, I want to put forth some of my own evidences and theories about it that might differ. The one thing that truly convinced me that the Mimic is possessed is something that I would have never noticed if not thanks to Mamakato, and that's that the very first words in big bold letters of the story The Mimic are, "Daddy, I'm a ghost." Man, people give Scott crap for poor writing sometimes, but this blatant in-your-face foreshadowing that David dies is top-notch. There are other things Mamakato points out in her video, like Mimic only picking up David's tiger plush specifically after David's death when every time before it only ever tried to pick up its own. But I really recommend you go check out her video for more of her evidence. Now, what I'd like to bring forth to the table is that the Mimic is specifically stated many times to have unnatural strength, and also when in the FNAF 6 building in the epilogues, it specifically has the ability to mess with electricity, being a giveaway for its location because wherever it is, the lights turn off. These are not features we see the Mimic have during the earliest parts of its story, before David dies. In fact, Edwin is worried at one point that the Mimic might crush David when it grabs him, but is then surprised at how gentle it is. This is contradicted by the Mimic killing people while mimicking chores later in the story, such as grabbing a man's brain directly out of his skull like it was no problem. These things would be difficult to explain without some form of supernatural influence. Now, I hear you. These could just be a result of the agony Edwin poured into it, and this is where it gets a lot more speculative on my end. Think back to the very first thing we ever saw for Secret of the Mimic, the reveal trailer. Remember all the confusion because it depicted Jackie coming out of a box while playing My Grandfather's Clock, which is a song heavily related to the puppet? Now, why would they do this? As far as we know, the Mimic has nothing to do with the puppet or Charlie or Henry, so what's the deal? Well, I believe that this detail is what tells us that David will possess the Mimic. The way David and Charlie die is suspiciously similar. Obviously, Charlie is intentionally killed, whereas David presumably wasn't. However, I believe that David's death will mirror Charlie's in a way that's meant to make us question everything. I believe that after David is killed in the road, the Mimic will crawl outside and lay down next to David's body, attempting to mimic him since it doesn't understand that he's been killed. And in that moment, David's soul will attach to the Mimic in the same way Charlie attached herself to the puppet. Now, I know many are concerned with what this would mean for David and the Mimic's characterization, but I want to assure you that the Mimic and its actions are still primarily all its own AI. How is this possible? Well, it's because of the nature of the Mimic's AI. We know from the animatronics in FNAF 1 that the children can't overcome the nature of the AI and the robots they possess, since they're forced to return to the stage at 6 AM every day. We also see this with Afton in FNAF 3. He's possessing the springlock suit, and yet he's forced to turn and walk towards the sound cues, even though he very likely wouldn't want to. With this in mind, the Mimic's programming is constantly running on Mimic mode. It doesn't have a set time to just wander to prevent servos from locking up like the FNAF 1 animatronics, so even if it was possessed, David would not be able to control or influence the Mimic. Now, if David is in the Mimic but can't control it at all, what's the point of the Mimic being possessed? Well, it means that David is around to witness all of the events that transpire around the Mimic. This would include Edwin beating the Mimic, which adds a whole layer of tragedy to the event. So, with all of this said, it's time to tackle the big one. What is the secret of the Mimic? Oftentimes in FNAF games that are titled as such, there's a double meaning to the title, one simple meaning and one revolving around the plot. So with this in mind, the simple reading of the secret of the Mimic is that the secret is of the Mimic, essentially just meaning that the existence of the Mimic was likely kept on a need-to-know basis by Fazbear. So what's the hidden meaning? Well, I believe it's possible that the secret is that the Mimic was possessed by David the whole time. This would make the Mimic the earliest possession in the series, and possibly the motivation for Afton to start looking into possession and seeking eternal life. All in all though, a lot of this is impossible to say for sure until the game releases tomorrow as of the time of this video releasing. And so I'm very interested to come back and see what I might have gotten right or what I may have gotten wrong. Feel free to come back to this video after having seen or played the game and let me know your thoughts in the comment. Thank you for watching.
This is the end of the company-wide mandatory update. We hope you enjoyed your stay here. Employees will be asked to leave comments or concerns in the space provided below this video. Please subscribe to Fazbear Entertainment to receive more company news, and remember to smile. You are the face of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza.